Hello, everyone. I am Mariam. I'm the director of the Georgian Center for Strategy and Development, and it is my honor and a pleasure to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, where we will be discussing the myths and misconceptions that exist in the debate about Russia. Today's event is, of course, based on the brilliant publication by the Chatham House, which dissects 16 most prevalent myths that exist in the West in relation to Russia, and then presents recommendations as to what the best or better policy would look like. Now, before I introduce the topic of today's discussion, I'd like to present to you our most outstanding panelists. And today we're very lucky to have with us James, who is a senior fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. He is also an associate fellow and former head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. He was a member of Social Studies faculty of Oxford University, a fellow of the Conflict Studies Research Center of the UK Ministry of Defense, and the director of studies at the Royal United Services Institute. He was awarded an OBE in 2020 for his services to British interests overseas. Then we are also very lucky to have Katerina Volchuk, who is an associate fellow of Chatham House-is Russia and Eurasia program and a professor of East European politics at the Center for Russian, European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Birmingham. She has a long experience of working with international organizations, think tanks, governments, and international media, and has extensively researched the post-Soviet countries. Last but never ever the least is Dr. Ben Noble, who became an associate fellow of Chatham House in December 2020, joining the Russia and Eurasia program. An expert on Russian domestic politics, he is a lecturer in Russian politics at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and a senior research fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. In 2019, he was awarded a Rising Star Engagement Award by the British Academy for a project on the closure of legislatures in non-democracies. James, Katerina, Ben, welcome, and thank you all for agreeing to do this today. Now, allow me to very briefly tell you how we came to this day and what our goal was. When I first saw this report by Chatham House, my team and I immediately agreed that it would be of a tremendous value to have it translated into Georgian and offered to the local audience here as, let's say, an additional resource to reflect about Russia, its role in international politics, and how this country works internally. Given the nature of sort of Russo-Georgian relations, I personally believe that what we need is more reflection about Russia, more analysis of the power it's willing to wield internationally, and a better understanding of the language and tools that Russian political elites employ to communicate with the outside world. Whilst this particular publication takes aim at the myths that exist in the West, some of those myths are also perpetuated in Georgia, like the idea that Russia was promised that NATO would never enlarge, or that it is allowed to have a sphere of privileged interest in its immediate surrounding, including, of course, the territories of neighbor states. Or indeed, that the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union are on the same level and similar institutions. There's, of course, several other myths that are perpetuated here in Georgia, and they're more carefully tailored to our local context, our culture, and experiences that our country has had. But like I said, today we'll be discussing 3 out of the 16 myths that are presented and sort of explored in the publication. We will start by, let me put it this way, zooming in and exploring the type of governance in Russia, which I believe will help us better understand how the country operates internally. We will then start zooming out a little bit and look at where Russia stands in relation to the West in terms of the competitiveness of some of its institutions and how it conducts its foreign policy. At this point, I would like to encourage everyone in the audience, everyone who may be joining us, to send in the questions, ask your questions. We welcome your questions. My team will make sure to send me your questions as we go along, and make sure you ask them so that I can then ask our speakers to answer those questions. So without further ado, and to make sure we don't concentrate too much on my introduction, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Ben Noble, to present the myth he co-wrote with Ekaterina Shulman about basically how Russia is run today. Ben, once again, thank you very, very much for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for the generous introduction and for the invitation to speak today. As you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about myth 15 in the report that I wrote with Ekaterina Shulman, and the title for that chapter, for that section, is "It's All About Putin. Russia is a manually run, centralized autocracy." And really the aim of this section of the report was to tackle the idea, the simplistic idea that governance in Russia is a one-man show, that it's all about Putin, that in order to understand all of politics in Russia, you just have to focus on that one individual. And so what Katya and I do in this section of the report is look at decision-making, decision implementation, as well as the role and nature of political institutions in Russia to tackle that simplistic, naive viewpoint. Now, I should start off by saying that none of this is to say that we think that Putin isn't powerful. He, of course, is. He very often is at the center of decision-making, especially on key decisions, including in foreign policy, and the other panelists will speak in more detail about that area. What our section is trying to do, though, is to make sure that we don't blow that out of proportion, to inappropriately generalize from certain cases to all cases and all modes of governance in Russia. And we start off the report by looking at the direct line. So this is the annual call-in that Putin hosts. And we think that that can be the starting point that people inappropriately generalize. So Putin is there. He appears to make decisions on the spot in relation to problems brought to him by Russian citizens. He then instructs lower level officials to implement these decisions, threatening that they will incur his wrath if they don't fulfill his orders faithfully. And in the direct line, Putin is directly communicating with citizens. He isn't relying on mediating institutions like parliament, like parties. But really, this is political theatre more than anything else. It's not a reflection of governance more generally, even though it's difficult to think that some people, when commenting on Russian politics, appreciate that. It seems to be that they do think that the direct line is a case study that you can generalize to all areas of governance. And when looking at this myth, there are both positive and negative views. So the positive view is backed by the Kremlin. That's the idea that Putin is the good Tsar, helping people and brushing aside the lower level officials who might be corrupt or incompetent. But then the other end, the sort of negative version, maybe you find that more in the West, and that's the idea that Putin is omnipotent, that he's this evil dictatorial villain. But we think, and we claim in the report, that both of these versions are wrong. And so let me talk in a bit more detail about what we say. So to begin with, of the three areas we look at, decision-making. Well, when you actually look at policymaking in Russia, it's really the exception that Putin would be directly involved. There's lots of delegation, including to executive ministries at the top level of the federal structure. But then also we need to appreciate that even though Putin might have the ability to intervene in all decisions, political decisions in the country, he doesn't necessarily want to. And that sometimes when he's forced to intervene, that isn't because he wants to, it's because he needs to, given the systemic dysfunction in the political system in the country. And another point that we have to appreciate that sometimes isn't appreciated is the agenda setting power of those around Putin. So even when Putin is right at the center of decision making, he's relying on information that's being filtered by a range of actors and bodies, including the presidential administration, including the Security Council, including the FSB, including the government. So moving from decision making to decision implementation, really when we look at the orders that Putin puts out, the norm very often is a lack of implementation. So when we look at presidential assignments, поручения, a report was done in 2020, which showed that for certain executive ministries, the majority of assignments are not fulfilled on time. But we can also look at more flagship policies like the May decrees and the national projects, which very often have their goals modified, which very often have their timelines, their deadlines kicked into the future. And this is a sign that just because Putin orders something, it doesn't mean that it's then faithfully implemented. Things can be forgotten and these orders can be revised. So that's decision implementation. And then the third feature we look at, the nature of political institutions. Often you come across this idea that political institutions of all stripes in Russia are complete shams. There's no point in studying them. That I, as a researcher of legislative politics in Russia, I am wasting my time. I should find something else to study. But what Katya, and I should say that Katya is also a scholar of legislative politics, what we show is that the Duma does not function like a legislature in a consolidated liberal democracy. That is clear, but it doesn't mean that it's a sham. It's interesting that when Katya and I look at it, the State Duma can provide a rare window into intra-executive policy differences. And so that shows that by focusing on the institution, we can learn more about government, but it also shows that there are different policy preferences within the executive in Russia. It's not as if people just wait to see what Putin says on a certain subjects and then they faithfully represent that position. The Ministry of Finance, for example, will often have bitter debates with the Ministry of Economic Development, and the State Duma is one area, one political institution where we can look into those policy differences. So what are the broader implications of this myth? Well, oftentimes because you will come across this assumption that Putin is at the center of all decision-making and governance in Russia, people will say, well, if only we can understand what Putin thinks on a certain matter, we will then be able to understand politics more broadly in Russia. But that ignores the fact that very often Putin isn't just dictating his own policy preferences. He can be asked to be the arbiter between different factions, between different groups. And so if we're just thinking about what Putin thinks, we would be ignoring the energy, the time necessary to find out what these different groups think. And that would be maybe a more fruitful area to look at. But also by just focusing on Putin, we can ignore some of the structural features that shape his thinking that are going to be around when he moves on in whichever mode that might be. And so just by focusing on the individual, we can forget some of these socioeconomic, some of these cultural factors that we may want to take into account. Another reason why the myth is counterproductive is because it sort of plays into the Kremlin's hands. The Kremlin clearly has an interest in portraying Putin as this very powerful individual. But really, when you look into the three areas that we note in the report, you see the limits of Putin's power, and you also see some of the weaknesses in the current political system in the country. And then the final point that we discuss in the chapter is that very often when you try and make this argument in Western circles, that it's not just black and white, that there are shades of grey, that Putin might not be involved in everything, there can be the accusation that, well, you clearly must be either a useful idiot or a paid agent of the Kremlin. And what we're trying to say is, no, we can be intellectually honest and realise these shades of grey, whilst also saying that it's not a sign of condoning what the Kremlin is doing. That we say that it really should be possible to judge Putin harshly whilst acknowledging that he doesn't rule Russia alone, and that there are other individuals, other institutions and other factors that we need to take into account in order to come up with a complete understanding insofar as that is possible. But let me finish by stressing a point that I began my short talk on, and that is that we're not saying that Putin is not powerful. We could spend lots of time looking at the case studies in which he is powerful, but we need to take into account these other factors in order to place that power in context, in order to understand how that power is constructed, but also to understand what the limits of that power might be. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, just as I was listening to you right now, and then also having read the myth several times in my preparations for today, the way I understand it, like I understand what you say about the criticism that you often face in relation to this particular position that you have. But the way I read it, the way I hear your words is that you're basically asking for not even asking, but well, yeah, asking for a more nuanced analysis of how governance happens in Russia. Am I correct to understand that?
Yes, it's about calling for nuance, but what I suppose I'm saying is that just because we're calling for nuance, it doesn't mean that we're not going to be ready if
Sure.
Putin oversteps a mark to judge him with the full force that other people might want to apply in every case. And that can be tricky because it requires an ability to understand when that type of forceful intervention is required. But yes, the very short version of the talk, Mariam, is saying we want a bit more nuance, and that nuance shouldn't be politicized.
Yeah, I suppose in a way things would be somewhat easier if the myth were true and if it really was just about him and if it didn't go beyond.
Oh, definitely. Sorry, I realize you've probably heard enough of me talking now, but we want to say that we understand why the myth is seductive. We understand as a heuristic, it can be easy for governments and people in the policy world to use this myth as a starting point. And as I say, in certain circumstances, that might be appropriate, but what we're saying is that it wouldn't be appropriate in all spheres of governance and at all times.
I see that. Thank you, Ben. I would now like to invite Katerina to present the myth that she wrote, or better said, explored, I suppose, and presented. And I have to say, this definitely is one of the myths that I have come across here in Georgia as well. I'll give you one more. I have heard people claim that the EU and the Soviet Union are essentially the same thing, which is very confusing to me, but I'm very happy that we are getting this chance to go into detail of this particular myth, exploring the EU versus the Eurasian Economic Union. So once again, Katerina, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak to Georgian colleagues, even just via Zoom. So we are talking about the myths. And there is a particular reason why myths exist and why they are so prevalent in policymaking and in policy debates on Russia, because there are useful cognitive shortcuts. The reality is very complex. We don't have time to study and engage in all aspects. So we look for those sort of attractive, but very often elusive, simplistic, basically explanation of what's going on and basing our policies on it. And Ben, obviously, I am very fortunate to capitalize with what I discuss about Eurasian integration on the preceding myths in the volume, but also on Ben's presentation, because this is Russia beyond Putin. And the Eurasian integration as a project is very interesting because it is like a pet project of Vladimir Putin being announced in 2011. It has been, for very legitimate reasons, latched on by Western policymakers, especially in the EU, not necessarily EU institutions, although some officials are very keen, including the EU ambassador to Russia, but some member states like Germany and France. So we have this complex post-Soviet project led by Russia, personally promoted by Putin, and yet there is much more behind the basically hidden from our eyes. So I do apologize. My presentation is going to be a tad more technical because we need to be technical. So we are moving between geopolitics, domestic institutions, and actually trade liberalization, because what with the myths never appear out of nowhere. You know, Putin has been in power for 20 years. He has nurtured this, the Kremlin, the Red Fortress idea, and being the all-powerful man. He has this time to develop this sort of myth, crafted personally. So the idea of Eurasian Union capitalizes and is linked to an idea basically from 30 years or so of basically Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Europe, Eurasia linked by common basically economic rules and free trade. So the Eurasian Union speaks to a pre-existing idea and capitalizes on it, and it actually makes it more attractive and sort of appealing. And yet, 30 years on, realities are anything but simple. So the idea of the Eurasian Economic Union launch is that it's a meaningful and effective project in economic integration. So at last, in basically around Russia, we have this equivalent, functional and meaningful equivalent to the EU. And this is the part of the myth that the Eurasian Union is actually about deep economic integration. And the key is in the word union. Union means it's actually about deep integration. It's not just about tariff elimination or liberalization. It is about changing rules of the game behind the scenes. So what we call non-tariff, basically tariffs and barriers to trade. This sounds technical, but it's actually very political. This is about member states changing how they basically regulate economic activity and trade by changing domestic rules and institutions. And what I mean changing, it's not just adopting laws, but actually implementing them. And implementation means we are talking about domestic governance. And Ben focused on that very well, that it's not just implementing food safety standards or certificates or custom rules. It is actually having well-functioning institutions which are committed and capable of implementing a common body of rules. And let's remember, the EU can only function. The EU doesn't have basically its own institutions in every member state. It just relies on domestic institutions and capacities in every member state to implement the common rules. And Eurasian Union doesn't have its Eurasian police in Belarus or in Kazakhstan. It relies on domestic institutions to implement the common, basically, textbook of rules. And this is where it becomes very tricky. So we have this Eurasian Union announced, and it looks very appealing. And then when we look how it is designed, how it functions, basically the mask is off. But when we are pressed for solutions, how to solve tensions between the EU and the West and Russia, economic liberalization seems like something that we can compartmentalize. This is something which can be done because it's a win-win situation. And yet when we look at Eurasian integration, we realize that it's anything but just an economic union. And it's very interesting, and I won't basically go into too much detail in terms of looking at the why Russia. And we're touching here on a much bigger issue of Russia's policy towards the post-Soviet countries and what underpins and what drives this policy, and to what extent an integration project is capable of overriding and replacing the basically bilateral or regional aims of Russia. And the basic economic truth is that Russia doesn't need Eurasian integration for trade liberalization. Russia, apart from Belarus, doesn't trade with any of the other four partners, which are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, that doesn't need basically their trade liberalization to achieve economic growth and to achieve prosperity. Member states normally pursue economic integration because of benefits they get. For Russia, the benefits are not economic, but the union is economic. So Russia has agreed to be constrained by a common body of rules, and yet actually it doesn't make sense because it makes hardly any difference if the union works or not. It doesn't make any difference for economic and welfare of the Russian population. So it is not about economic integration. It is about recreating, being a great power. Great powers have regional projects. And from that point of view is this sort of attribute, accessory of being a great power, but also Eurasian integration is about constraining the smaller member states. So we know they are constrained in terms of the economic and trade policies, but Russia is not. So from that point of view, the Eurasian Union allows Russia to play the role which I called a Eurasian gatekeeper. That basically Russia is free to pursue its own policies, but the member states, like Armenia, could not enter a free trade agreement with the EU because of its rather involuntary accession to the EU. So this is sort of the rationale for doing Eurasian integration. If we look at the hard economic figures, they tell us that Eurasian Economic Union is not an economic project for Russia. And it's visible in Russia's behavior because Russia, or the Russian leadership, disrespects the rules of the union and acts unilaterally within the union. We know this sort of this strategic bilateralism has characterized Russia's behavior towards the post-Soviet states. Interestingly, within the union, it's a hub and spoke approach as well. So it's a set of bilateral relations within under the umbrella of the union. So those are sort of the realities of the Eurasian Union becoming like a vehicle for Russia acting as a Eurasian gatekeeper. But what is interesting that also that in the EU, because we, in order to understand this process, you need to look at politics, governance, you need to look at politics of Armenia and Belarus, for example. And yet there is this tendency to basically what I call isomorphism, presuming that because we have the EU, if we have the Eurasian Union, it must be an equivalent. And looking at the headlines, looking at the narrative, a beautiful narrative, and taking it at the face value. And what we have as a result, and that's my the final sort of substantive point, is the idea that we can resolve tensions with Russia by engaging with Eurasian Union and having a free trade zone from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And that would somehow basically reduce or perhaps just sort of, or even eliminate geopolitical tensions. So this thinking that trade liberalization is a solution to basically and creating a stake for everybody in closer interactions. And this is elusive, and there have been studies saying that basically if Russia wanted to do trade liberalization with the EU, it doesn't need Eurasian Union. It could have done it already. It hasn't done it for very good domestic reasons. In terms of Russian economy being not competitive, domestic liberalization and restructuring would have to happen for the Russian economy to become stronger and more competitive vis-a-vis the EU. For the current political regime, based on basically loyalty and rent extraction and at various levels of governance, this is not exactly an attractive proposition to go, even though for Russia it would be good in the long term. So what we are saying, be careful. What I'm saying in my contribution, be careful, make your research, don't fall for easy solutions, because the reality is exceedingly complex and it's not necessarily, favoring those explanations that you can do this integration of integrations, and that would provide, if anything, it could actually enhance Russia's preponderance, domination in the post-Soviet space, and that would be counterproductive to EU's interest in the Eastern Partnership region. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Katerina, for this. I think it was an interesting experience listening to you explain how this union is essentially about political power more than it is about economic integration, and how it is more about sort of the ability to exert its own power over the members, other members, and essentially Russia, at least to me, it does appear that Russia may be the only power really truly benefiting politically speaking, from this this union, rather than sort of it being an actual opportunity for the other member states to grow economically, or have access to better markets, or whatever it may be.
Can I just come back on this very quickly?
Sure.
Where the union works is basically as a labor sort of migration union. The member states have a privileged access to the Russian labor market. Having said that, so in terms of trade, we've seen since the creation of the union, we've seen the member states diversifying, moving away from the union. So the intra-union trade has been lowered since the union has been created, which means we are talking about economic disintegration rather than integration. But one success story is basically the labor migration aspect. Having said, the pandemic has been a real blow to that aspect because of the pandemic and economic crisis as such. So it is a very complex picture, but the member states have some benefits, but definitely they have not managed to tame Russia in terms of respecting the rules of the game. Thank you.
I see that. Thank you very, very much. Now, I'm very happy to now invite our final speaker, James Scher, to present the myth that he wrote, myth number 1, essentially about Russia and the West being as bad as each other. Thank you for being with us, James.
Mariam, first of all, we were enormously grateful and touched to see the immediate and positive interest generated by the publication of this report, and in the Georgian language as well. It's very good to be here because I miss Georgia profoundly. Forgive me, but may I remind you, Mariam, and everyone else, that in fact I am here to talk about Russian myths regarding Ukraine, and particularly the view that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. One of Russia's quizzical characteristics over years and centuries has been a practice of incorporating the history and identity of others into its own. The state-minded Russians have a considerable talent and even greater confidence for telling other people who they are not, what their history and culture allows them to do, and what it does not allow them to do. At a personal level, of course, such behavior is infuriating. At a national level, it is profoundly irritating, to say the least, and Georgians need no reminder from me as to how irritating this is. But in the case of Ukraine, it is rather different, because the essential myth is that Ukraine is at the minimum a part of the great Russian people, and in other formulations, Ukrainians and Russians are одинаковые. We are one and the same people, a refrain that Putin repeats continually. And this view, Russia's view of what Ukraine is and its history, over many years has pollinated not only political circles in the West, but expert circles in universities and elsewhere. Why? Because in the Soviet period, people studied the Soviet Union and they became Sovietologists, and the most prominent of them were very Russo-centric. And to some extent that remains so. There has been a correction, of course, but it has always been very difficult in the West to find real experts who understood that the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before it was a construction of very different people with different histories. When Paul Goebel was appointed to the US State Department, I think in 1990, he was the first person appointed to the US State Department whose expertise was the non-Russian people of the Soviet Union, and nobody listened to him. And after Bush gave his so-called Chicken Kiev speech, he resigned almost the next day. So this is part of what we have inherited. Now, all of this is very bad practice, but does that make it a myth? Aren't the Russian people and Ukrainian people essentially the same? Isn't Ukraine's history a branch of Russian history? No, that is a myth. No, it isn't. So let me make, as quickly and concisely as I can, 4 brief points. First, let's not discuss origins, please. Let's not discuss the relationship between Rus and Россия. Let's not discuss when the word Ukraina or Ukraina first appeared, because these little nuances have very little impact on how people actually define themselves and what made them what they are. What needs to be understood, going well back into history, is that the Tatar-Mongol conquest separated northern Rus and southern Rus for 300 years and launched what we now call Russia and Ukraine on 2 very different trajectories. And in that, you must factor in the enormous influence in what we now call Ukraine of the Kingdom of Lithuania and what became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And also a lot of which was Catholic, but not exclusively at all. And the fact that all of this was a European formation with a European culture. Even Russians who acknowledge that fact, nevertheless say, well, the rest therefore is Russian. Well, no, it wasn't. Southern Ukraine was more or less under one form or another of Byzantine and Tatar domination, including, of course, Crimea, that had only been a subject of Russian sovereignty, of Russian jurisdiction for 168 years in its history. Even Ivan III's gathering of Russian lands in the 15th century only encroached upon one part of Ukraine, what is now simply an oblast of Chernihiv. Without becoming abstruse, no, we are not talking about the same historical entities, despite overlaps. Secondly, there is, of course, related to this, the myth that what ties together Ukraine and Russia is the Russian Orthodox faith. Well, that is mistaken as well, because those who so easily accept that have failed to make the fundamental distinction between Eastern Orthodoxy, centered on the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople, and Russian Orthodoxy, which only effectively became Russian Orthodoxy once the Moscow Patriarchate was founded, and which, having been founded within 2 centuries, became incorporated into the imperial and state structures of Russia. In Ukraine, the whole history of Orthodoxy was different. Its spiritual sources were, and its spiritual sources of support, and even political support, if you could put it this way, in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was resisting incorporation by the Moscow Patriarch, came from the ecumenical patriarch. Ivan Mazepa, who is possibly the most celebrated of all Ukrainian nationalists who fought against Peter the Great in the Battle of Poltava, and of course lost, he was ardently Orthodox. Philip Orlik, who framed the first Ukrainian constitution, a very pluralistic and democratic constitution, was also devoutly Orthodox. In Ukrainian history, there's no relationship between being Orthodox and being Russian orientated or being pro-Russian. Ukrainian Russian Orthodoxy has become a creature of power, state power. The reason we don't call Tsarist Russia a theocracy is that in a theocracy, it's the theocratic authorities who hold power and the political authorities are subordinate to them. In Russia, it has always been the opposite. In Ukraine, you do not have historically a connection between orthodoxy and state power at all. This is a profound difference. Third point, political culture. Russian political culture has for centuries been defined by what Russians call государственность, statehood, state-mindedness. Ukrainian political culture has arisen in the absence of a unified state. It is intrinsically pluralistic, in some respects, even anarchic. And instead of being defined by connection to power, it has always been defined by distrust of power. This is an enormous strength, but also a telling weakness of the current Ukrainian state and setup. But without this intrinsic pluralism, this belief of people that we can rely on ourselves, make our own connections, make our own decisions, Ukraine would not have survived the onslaught of 2014 and might not have survived a number of other things either. Last point. The Russian myths about Ukraine are, like so many other Russian formulations, self-evidently contradictory. If Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, how could you start a war on the basis that Ukraine is discriminating against Russian compatriots? Which is it, please? Begging the question, how on earth, even if fascists had come to power in Kiev in 2014, they would have had the military and administrative wherewithal to put pressure on Russian-speaking people living in Donbass. But if you leave this, you will blot out of your consciousness the fact that I think it is still the case now, but it was certainly the case in 2014, 2015. The majority of people serving in the Ukrainian armed forces and the volunteer battalions who were fighting for Ukraine were Russian speakers. And most of them lived in those localities. They didn't come from Ternopil and Lviv. When the Russians launched their project, it's a second project for regathering Catherine the Great's Novorossiya, they really did believe, and to a large extent still do, that Russian speakers are somehow loyal to Russia, and that this question determines all others. And they're very resistant, despite demonstration after demonstration, that these things are not true. If you're Russian, you can understand why they're resistant to that. We are not Russian, and we have no excuse. And it is time that we thought more carefully about how to get all the significant stakeholders in the West to understand Ukraine as Ukraine and not as a reflection of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I think a lot of that is, especially the point about the orthodoxy, that myth is most definitely, and I can feel it resonating well, or at least the majority of our audience feeling how that myth, the sort of this sisterhood or brotherhood between the two churches, the Orthodoxy in Georgia and the Orthodoxy in Russia, somehow forming this basis for a bond that we supposedly have. So I think this will resonate with a lot of people. We are getting some questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, Maya, I will move on to that part of our conversation, because the questions that I'm getting are about, I think, every topic that we've discussed so far. I think there's one question which is asking for a clarification, maybe. This is the way, from what I understand, this is for Katerina in this case. The question is, what do you mean Russia does not have the economic relationship with Armenia? I think this must be some sort of a misunderstanding, because I don't remember Katerina saying that. Right? Yeah, okay, we're in agreement about that. Then the question is that can we assume that the Eurasian Union could ever be economically compatible with the EU, maybe even in the future? Katerina, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. Let me start from Armenia. Indeed, this refers to the concept that I use, the hub and spoke. Normally, within unions, you have trade between various member states. We know from Brexit, for example, that Portuguese and Spanish products actually it became more difficult for them to access the British market. So Germany is the biggest economy of the European Union, and yet member states just do not trade with Germany. We have actually free trade. So we have Portugal trading with Poland, and Poland trading, for example, with France, even though Germany is the biggest economy. What we have, so there is multilateral trade, and we know the level of integration is very high. Member states trade not only with the biggest member state, but with other states. And the German economy actually accounts for 27% of the EU. So from that point of view, Germany is big, but it's not that dominant. Russia accounts for about 87% of the economy of the Eurasian Union. It is actually the big elephant. But the most important aspect is that the other member states, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan, mainly trade with Russia. So Armenia trades with Russia, but Armenia doesn't trade with Belarus or Kazakhstan. So it's a hub and spoke approach. So it's still, we are talking about bilateral trade mainly within the Eurasian Union, which doesn't change power dynamics because Armenia, like Georgia, are still dependent on basically what's happening in the Kremlin with regard to granting or denying access to certain countries, like Ukraine, for example, and also even certain products. So from that point of view, does Armenia trades within the Eurasian Union, but it trades with Russia mainly. And for a union to be meaningful, more than we had something different, which we had before, it would have to trade with other member states. So neither trade nor power dynamics are different from being outside the union. So that's on Armenia. But now, I mean, for the Eurasian Union, the most important aspect is commitment and governance. And this touches on basically the issue of governance. All post-Soviet states suffer from a number of common weaknesses. We all now can confidently say that we are talking about Soviet legacies, as some people call it, of misdevelopment. And over the last 30 years, we've seen various strategies of coping with this sort of problem of misdevelopment, but relatively sort of weak governing institutions. And Georgia is an exception in terms of actually reforming up to a certain extent the inherited institutions, state basically institutions. This is a common problem. And the union is only as good as the type of governance in its member states. And it's not that it could not be improved, including Russia, but to what extent political leadership is interested in it. I mean, political elites live from elections to elections. Do they want to, to invest in various, anti-monopolist committees, etc. But also the understanding why they are participating in this project. And finally, the final point here is the role of Russia. The EBRD, the European Bank for Development and Reconstruction, I think that's the title, talks about big dominant states in regional projects being leading, they need to act as leading as a leading goose. They need to basically steer. And when we have weaker aspects in terms of governance in the member states, they can actually provide assistance, they can apply conditionality. To the best of my knowledge, over the last 20 years, since Putin coming to power, I have to say it was different under Yeltsin. Russia has not really been promoting good governance and promoting solutions to common problems. So what we have, Russia doesn't invest in basically in improving, creating preconditions for the union to be effective. Rather, it's, as we know, capitalizing on weaknesses and dependencies to achieve its foreign policy aims. So in theory, yes, but in practice, a lot would have to change for the Eurasian Union to be more like a genuine union. And what we see as it is, the commitment from the member states, including the Russian leadership, is just not there. Going back to Putin, Putin seems to have lost interest in Eurasian Union. He still does sort of rhetorical narrative, but vis-a-vis Belarus, he talks about the state union. That's a very different project. If we have the Eurasian Union, why do we need to have the state union? So we have almost this sort of habitual coming up with new projects, and the attention span of the Russian leadership being relatively sort of short, and yet another project being resuscitated. This does not bode well for the future of the Eurasian Union. I would like to see better governance. I would like Russia to play this sort of leading goose role in the post-Soviet space, but under the current leadership, I think that probably a tad too optimistic.
Thank you very much for the answers. I think we've answered both of those. You've answered both of those questions. If not, I welcome the audience member to clarify their questions if they require any more information about that. There's another question which I believe is for James. You have set a line between Eastern and Russian Orthodoxy. What role did the Russian Orthodox Church have in the course of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and what specific instruments did it use?
Very interesting and good question, and a key one, because I think if it had, if the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine had not behaved in the way it did, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which of course acquired autocephaly from the ecumenical patriarch, today I suspect would not have come into being. A considerable number of Russian Orthodox clerics after the events of 2014 openly identified themselves with the Donbass and Russian cause, and even urged their parishioners to go out and take up arms and fight for their Russian compatriots. And some of them did themselves, and very interesting stories. What's his name? Girkin, who calls himself Strelkov, who was the initial so-called defense minister of the so-called Donbass People's Republic, boasted that his entire armed security detail came from the from Orthodox clergy. So this stimulated in a large number of parishes, an emptying out of parishes, and greatly strengthened what had been effectively the Ukrainian Patriarchate, which had up to that point no ecclesiastical recognition outside the country. And these events made Patriarch Bartholomew understand that it was now inescapable, that he had no choice but to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. By the way, I can't resist saying, several years ago, I was in Kiev, and there was a panel discussion, and there were representatives of the Greek Catholic Church there, and the newly found Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And when the latter spoke, it was extremely interesting, because they didn't speak about politics at all. They spoke about Christianity. They spoke about the eternal duty of the church to protect people from power and privilege and injustice, whoever they were, to strengthen their dignity and all the rest of us. This is, exceptionally unusual. Whenever I have visited representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, they talk about subordinates with Russia, connection to Russia and the Russian state and Russian culture and Russian history and Russian greatness. So it really is something very different, and at least to my mind, recognizably Christian.
Thank you for that, James. I think there's more questions for you. One of them is what's been the effect, I suppose, of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine on that specific myth of Ukrainians and Russians being the same people.
Well, we know about, of course, Putin's article. This is not going away. I mean, I come onto Ben's territory slightly and perhaps deliberately. There is, what is interesting is that, and this is a long historical tendency, the orientation of Russians to their own political system, the degree to which they regard themselves as liberal, European, democratic, all the rest of it, is almost unrelated to how most Russians think about the Ukrainian issue. There's an old Russian expression that Russian democracy stops where the question of Ukraine begins. Those of us who have a number of friends in Russia, highly educated, well-traveled people, all the rest of it, encounter this every single day. I was having dinner not so long ago with a Russian friend of mine in Tallinn, very, very liberal, and he lives here for a reason. And he just said to me point blank, we created Ukraine. Well, one hears this all the time. So this is a very deeply rooted myth in Russia. I want to alert some of you to the fact that Dmitry Trenin, who of course will be as well known in Georgia as he is everywhere else, has recently in Carnegie published an extremely interesting article challenging a lot of the basic postulates in Putin's article, both about Russia's origins, about the necessity of Russia and Ukraine to be together, about what makes Russia Russia. Later on, of course, he has some things to say that you would associate with a very enlightened, benign Russian statist, Dzержavnik, like Trenin. But it's a very interesting article, and I would recommend those who haven't read it to read it, because it makes one wonder. He doesn't write anything without a purpose. What is his purpose? Is it symptomatic of some deeper discussion taking place there in certain circles, or not? But the article deserves discussion. Forgive that long.
It most certainly deserves discussion, and I did read the article after you suggested it, and I have been struggling with formulating a question for you about that, so I'm glad you touched upon that. It really is a very interesting article, which has caused a little bit of a stir. So I think it might be a good idea for us to put the link to the article in the comment section once this is done, because I have the link. I will share it with everyone maybe once we're done with the conversation, and perhaps people might find it interesting to read the article, because it really is written in a very interesting way that is I think that I suppose that was expected to have caused the reaction that it did. So we'll see what happens about that article, or what actions come after it. There's more questions.
And there's Ben, who wants to reply.
Ben, would you like to reply to this?
I was just briefly, I was going to thank James for bringing up that particular example, because it provides a nice case study of the point I was trying to make, that just by focusing on Putin, we can sometimes slip into the idea that if he were to move on, retiring, dying, whatever, that things would automatically change. Whereas when we look at a case in which even liberal Russians might support a position that is clearly different to the interests of the West, that's you know, it shakes us out of the belief, the simplistic, naive belief that all will be well, and that's certainly another myth that is discussed by Nikolai Petrov in the report. I think it's myth number 16. So thanks, James, for raising that particular issue. It might be that you had another idea in mind as to how it might, that particular comment, your response might relate to my section with Katya. That's the way that I interpreted it. So yeah, a good case study. Thanks.
Just a quick comment for Nico. Katerina just put the Carnegie article in the comment section here. So if you are technically able to do that, if you could just copy and paste it into the comment section of the live discussion. If not, we will post it after the conversation. I have to say, there's a lot of questions. The next one is, so in addition to one, media literacy among general population and vulnerable target groups, and two, fact-checking by CSOs, what other efforts would you recommend to dispel the discussed myths? Can you give successful examples of communication campaigns or national authorities' efforts to counter such myths elsewhere? I suppose this is a rather general question. I don't think it has a specific, I don't think it's addressed to a specific speaker. So if anyone's willing to talk about that, they're more than welcome.
Oof. All I could say philosophically is you'll never solve a problem until you admit to yourself that you have one. And I think in the West, people who should know better have underestimated the extent to which we do have a problem in understanding. It is, you see, again, it's another interesting fact, at least it's my perception. I would welcome Ben and Katya's views on this, that many people today who really matter, and meet them in foreign ministries, defense ministries, and elsewhere all the time, who now accept the view that Russia is an adversary of the West. Nevertheless, when the subject turns to Ukraine, or for that matter to Georgia, they seem to have a very Russian view about who these people and who these places are. And what they oppose about Russia's behavior in Ukraine is not that they're wrong about what Ukraine is, but they violated international law, they used military force, they did unprecedented and disturbing things, and they're militarizing the Black Sea and so on and so forth. It is hard to find high-level statements and meaningful statements by opinion leaders that challenge these very deeply embedded images that we have, not only about Ukraine, but a whole range of other things where Russia is involved. The further west you go in Europe, and of course, leave North America out of the discussion for a minute, the further west you go, the less comprehension, understanding there is of this history you have lived with and lived through, and which is not over. If Ben and Katya are silent, I would presume it's because they agree with me. But,
Well, one thing that I would raise is that, James, your comment underscores the point that the solution isn't as easy as maybe might come across from the section that Katya and I wrote, and we're saying we need more experts in Russia. Really, the extension is, yes, we need experts in Russia to understand decision-making, governance, the things that we speak about, but we also need people who are aware of the culture, the languages, the politics, the economics of the countries around Russia, so that we don't just end up recycling this Moscow-centric view. And of course, that isn't going to be welcome news to finance ministries in various countries, never mind ministries of foreign affairs, because it requires money. But certainly, I think in the UK, more investment is needed from the state in expertise of Russia, as well as countries around Russia, if we are to come up with sensible policymaking. And I'll just repeat the point that James made, that doesn't recycle these myths. So hopefully the report will nudge them in that direction, although of course it will depend on somebody controlling the purse strings to pay for that expensive training. But hopefully it is worthwhile in the long term. It's just convincing people to think about the long term and not just the short termism that can very often be prevalent.
I can't resist adding one thing. I'm probably not alone. You know, occasionally I'm invited to share my thoughts with younger experts in on Russia in diplomatic establishments. I'll make a point here that I always make there, which is easy to overlook. You will never understand Russia if you understand only Russia. You have to get into your bloodstream, into your bone marrow, an equal understanding of at least one other significant country that Russia has historically influenced. Not just to understand their point of view, but to understand what Russians do there. I have watched Russians in academic and in high-level political meetings in Ukraine say and do things, and I've watched the reaction of people, pro-Russian, basically Russian-minded Ukrainians in Kiev, sitting around the table, turning brown with anger because of the way someone like Viktor Chernomyrdin told them what they could and couldn't do. You could never see that. You could never learn about it. That whole side of reality, if you're sitting in Moscow, whatever sort of views you have, you will just not discover these things sitting in Moscow. So, I mean, this is, I think this has to be a part of everyone's curriculum. Thanks.
Katerina, are you ready?
I'll just come back on this point, how important it is. And I'll go back to the training article. And it's a fascinating piece of writing. Obviously, why the rationale, as James said, training doesn't write anything by accident. So this reflects something. But the way it reflects, even though the ultimate message is, it is not in Russia's interest to be engaged and claim we are one people, he goes directly opposite Putin's narrative. And yet, the way he does it is full of offensive, demeaning statements, basically showing disdain for Ukraine. Ukraine, it's not worth our engagement. So the narrative, Trenin uses the currency of the Russian discourse around Ukraine and basically uses this to turn around and say, actually, the country is not worth our affection. And the way he does it triggers instantly emotions. What is interesting that many Western experts, without realizing what it means, the language, the arguments he uses, what it does to actually be counterproductive. And actually, it sort of deepens the chars, deepens sort of the disdain in Ukraine for Russia, because this is what we're talking about. And there is this saying that, you know, in a marriage, all kinds of sort of sins may be forgiven. One emotion which is totally destroying to any relationship is disdain. And we have it on both sides in Russia-Ukraine relations. And
I have never met a Russian. I have never met a Russian who has expressed any kind of respect for Ukraine or Ukrainians.
They do express affection, you know, for Ukraine.
Affection. We love you.
Yes.
Boris Yeltsin used to spend all his time saying, we love you, we want to be with you, we want you even closer. And Ukrainians didn't want to hear that. He was always saying to them, you're the same as we are. And he really thought that this is what they wanted to hear. There's such incomprehension. They really wanted to hear something else. We respect also your differences.
That's a very important point that I believe many people, especially in Georgia, would agree that the supposed "we love you" is definitely a narrative that has been put forth by many opinion leaders in Russia in relation to Georgia as well, and I'm sure in relation to Ukraine as well. Yet the "we respect you" is never there. So I understand the frustration. And in that article, in the Trenin article, one thing that struck me, amongst other things, is there's a part where he says that for any, I don't want to misquote it, but from what I remember, it says something along the lines of, for any meaningful change to happen between the two sort of countries, what needs to happen is that there needs to be a different sort of power, or a different political entity in power in Ukraine. And it just left there without even acknowledging that perhaps some changes might also need to happen in Russia. But it's just left there. So yeah, like I said, I mean, I do think that it was expected.
Zelensky, who came to power, saying we would have peace in 6 months and that he could deal with the Russians, and has now changed his entire outlook 180 degrees. All of this occurred clearly because his mind was poisoned by some Banderist neo-fascists in Kiev, and Russia had nothing to do with changing his very positive outlook about how this conflict could end. It is really quite remarkable, but you know, there we are.
All right. Well, we have more questions. In order to boost the myth of Russians being discriminated against in Ukraine, the Russian Federation started to offer and issue Russian citizenship to the people who resided in Crimea. This, on one hand, has affected the myth of Russians being discriminated against, and on the other hand, changed the social proportions in Crimea to gain the Russian Federation an opportunity to develop the narrative where the Russian Federation needs to defend Russian citizens outside its territories. How has Ukraine learned from this experience? I mean, part of this is also part of our experience, because we know that the passportization is sort of a necessary precondition before a lot of Russia's foreign engagement. I muted myself too quickly. Would anyone like to comment on this?
You know, apart from the fact that on grounds of international law, this is not a legitimate practice, and there is no reason to recognize it. The interesting question for me, and I think for Katya as well, is why do so many people accept it? That is to say, why do so many residents of Crimea and of the Donbass accept Russian passports? Leaving aside the pressure dimension, and there is a dimension of pressure in this, no doubt. If you are living in a place like Donetsk now, which is a black hole, Luhansk worse, run by gangsters and mafias, it's a mafia state, and a conflict zone. If someone offered you a Russian passport and a right to live in Russia, wouldn't you take it? Does you know, to read into this some kind of cosmology of loyalties is, you know, it involves just too many extrapolations to make. I don't know if my colleagues would agree with me, but you have to consider the environment in which these events are taking place, the practical choices that people perceive they have. The ones who are really entrepreneurial and educated enough to get out and go live in unoccupied Ukraine have done so. The 1.6 million residents of Donbass have resettled quite successfully in unoccupied Ukraine. You could say they're the best and the brightest of Donbass. What about the rest of that? Katya, are you in agreement with me, broadly speaking?
I very much agree. We're talking about survival strategies. Yes. But this passportization, which obviously is so well known to Georgia, I think this is perhaps going back to the Russian way of governance and engaging with the post-Soviet states. I mean the incoherence and inconsistency in Russian policy, that we have multiple narratives, overlapping sort of factors shaping. And then we have this policy of saying, on the one hand, we're one people, on the other hand, issuing passports. And Russia promotes reintegration. You know, the Minsk agreements are about reinserting Donbass on new terms. It's a sort of redrawing Ukrainian statehood by having this enclave, autonomous enclave. So it is about changing Ukraine by basically promoting the reintegration of Donbass, but it doesn't add up with passportization, with having Russian citizens there. So the whole policy package, we have narratives, but when you look on the ground on so many aspects, they are almost counterproductive, counterintuitive. And this is what I've been saying with my colleagues. We did a large EU-funded project, actually, that rather than looking, and there's so much in the West looking for this sort of simplicity and coherence, we actually need to explore the incoherence of Russia's policy in the near abroad. And I'll just add at this point something which I have become only aware, but I'm capitalizing on my experience of living, being a migrant in the UK. So I had to learn English, and I know that people can tell relatively quickly on a bad day that I'm somewhere from the Netherlands, on a good day, I'm told that I'm from South Africa. I sound, on some occasions, near native, but I'm not quite from here, but I'm fluent enough. So I sound Dutch, but I'm a bit too native. So South Africa being, South Afrikaner being just probably, you know, some people located me there. What happened to Russian? We're talking about Russian speakers and ethnic Russians and, you know, all kinds of concepts, Ruski Mir, Orthodoxy, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, compatriots, a whole plethora of accents. What has happened to the Russian language since the collapse of the USSR? And in Georgia, we know only too well, Georgians speak Russian with an accent. And Ukrainians are native speakers of Russian, but Russian is becoming more like English. English within a couple of words can detect a native and non-native speaker. And I actually, this is an example from the war zone. A young man from Donetsk is fighting on the streets. He's a history graduate who happens to retell the story. And they are being shot at. And he says, "Kto это?" Who is it? And the answer is "Svai." For me, the way he said "Svai" and the way that was identical. By one vowel in "Svai," he could hear those are not Svai. And that one vowel, pronunciation of vowels by Russians in Russia and in Ukraine was enough for him to differentiate it. And for him, it was a matter of life or death. And what we've seen, and then I did a bit of experiment with my English students, but also with Russians from Russia. And I've realized, because Russians hear so many regional accents, they don't know. People speak with, the, you know, are they from North Caucasus or from the South Caucasus? They don't know the linguistic boundaries of Russia. So it's a one-way street. Ukrainians, Russian speakers from Ukraine can tell who is from Ukraine, who is from Russia. Russians cannot tell. And they are not aware of this. They are not aware that they are literally identified by one word or one sentence. And hence the narrative of Russian speakers, which has basically its very strong limitations.
That's how people in Kharkiv immediately recognized in February 2014 that there was suddenly a lot of people there who were not theirs, who were Chuzhir. It's not just that, but body language as well. I can recognize, but you know, it's anyway. I won't say any more, particularly since there probably still is a queue of questions, isn't there, Marianne?
There really is. And there's a question, I believe this question is for Ben. And
Good.
This is actually, I'm happy that this question is here because I was going to ask you something similar. So the question is, recognizing that Russia has a very complex form of governance, and that Vladimir Putin is not the only factor defining the Russian policy, including against neighboring independent countries, how can the policy of these countries, or the countries affected by Russian aggressive behavior, adjust their policy towards her? Because my question was going to be, I know that the report is mainly addressed, like it addresses Western governments and it addresses the political West, sort of. But you know, in this particular context, it would also be interesting to hear your thoughts, if any, about how could governments such as, you know, the Georgian one address or adjust their policies to that particular aspect, the things that you discussed about how governance in Russia happens.
Yeah, it's a great question, but my response is going to be deeply underwhelming, and that's that I'm not in the position to understand it. You know, it was very much written with the UK experience in mind, as well as more broadly the West. And what I see in conversation with foreign policy experts, with officials in Whitehall, but also academics, thinking, you know, what are the assumptions there that people don't often state? And much as I'm sorry to admit it, I'm less aware of those assumptions in that environment, for example, in the Georgian context. So I'd be fascinated to hear from you, Mariam, what you think, how the section that Kasia and I wrote would resonate, or whether the policy community in Georgia would say, no, it's fine. We realize that Putin might have a disproportionate role in lots of spheres of policymaking, but we also know that he doesn't sometimes want to intervene, or that there are clearly ways in which his power is constrained. So, you know, I'm going to do the awful thing and flip it back to you. What do you think? What's the takeaway of our chapter in the Georgian context, never mind the other countries that might be involved?
Well, I suppose I too feel at a little bit of a disadvantage here, because I wouldn't allow myself to go into as much detail answering that question as maybe with other things. But what I do think, as a general recommendation, what I would say is sort of going back to what this effort by GCSD and by myself is all about. I would advocate for a more in-depth analysis and a more in-depth look at all aspects of how governance happens in Russia, because here too we do have certain understandings of what Russia is, how it's run, who runs the show, so to speak. And I believe that the more we limit ourselves to superficial sort of statements, the more we limit ourselves in terms of having an effective policy. So this, I understand that this is a very, very general recommendation, but I believe this is where things have to start for us. A reevaluation, a constant reevaluation of what Russia is. And in my view, this is the only way we can have any type of policy that reaps any benefits for us as a country, as a country that is currently in a conflict with Russia, that currently has territories of its, you know, parts of its soil occupied. So again, a general recommendation, but this is where I believe it has to start.
Mariam,
more questions.
Sorry, if you don't mind me just very, very quickly intervening, because I think it chimes well with James and the example of the Trenin article, that James said that whenever Dmitry Trenin writes anything, he's got a purpose. And we might not know what that purpose is, but there are some clear hypotheses. And one of those hypotheses is that this reflects thinking of certain factions within the ruling elite. And you can't even get into that mindset if you're thinking it's all about Putin. So I think maybe one element when we're recommending be more nuanced, take into consideration the complexities of governance and decision-making in Russia, that's really asking people to be aware that there are different viewpoints on lots of policy matters, including in foreign policy, and especially when thinking about succession in Russia. If the policy communities in countries around the world aren't aware of that sort of younger generation, if not a couple of generations under Putin, of who they are, what they think, then they're going to be at a disadvantage when Putin finally is no longer president. So I suppose that's thinking slightly in the longer term, but that would be a policy a way in which that policy recommendation could actually be applied. Be aware of those different policy groups, be aware of those policy differences, and map them out as clearly as possible.
Yeah, if I may just say one more thing about this issue, is that we do have in Georgia, it's like even within the younger generation, we have people, we have experts who carry a tremendous amount of knowledge about specifically those things. Some of them that I currently have in mind are UCL graduates. They have a very, very deep understanding of all formal and informal practices in Russia, of the different political sort of circles and classes in Russia. And I think, again, looking to these people and seeking for their advice in these matters would be instrumental, because it's one thing to, of course, be engaging in conversations such as for this one with our international partners and the countries whose experiences we are, ultimately interested in. But with that said, we also have people here in Georgia who do have a very, very deep understanding of that. So I would advocate, in addition to sort of this general advice that I had, look more in depth at what Russia is doing and how it's doing it. I would also advise that we do turn to the people who are here, who already carry that knowledge and who are ready to apply that knowledge and give out valuable advice, policy advice. Now, sure, James.
Yeah, it might even come across as a question to Ben, which is not altogether bad. The one also in these discussions has to consider interests. The people who sit around the table, who constitute Putin's inner circle and also the most powerful people of Russia, are most of them in their own right multi-billionaires. And there were multi-billionaires with significant interests when Yeltsin was in power. But in those days in Russia, you had this system, which Russians call mnogoголосие, this kind of confuses dissonance, multi-voicedness. A lot of the people, Gazprom, for example, was pursuing was a factor in its own right in Ukraine, even when it was unclear what Russia's policy was, wonder what Gazprom's policy was in Ukraine. Well, don't we need to think more in these terms as we look forward to how the Putin system is going to evolve, whether he's there or whether he's not there? I'm sure I'm not challenging anything Ben believes, but this adds to the uncertainties and it strengthens the underlying point that he and others in our book have been making. Russia's a complicated beast and it's difficult to rule.
Yeah, and I think that chimes with what has been said about incoherence in foreign policy. That, if it can be very easy, and you see people do it all the time, especially in the media, making it seem as though Russia is always in control, that they have the upper hand, that because there is less tolerance for dissent, less tolerance for pluralism, that allows them to speak with one mind. But that's absolute nonsense. We can see incoherence in the foreign policy sphere, as Katerina mentioned, but also in domestic policy making as well. So how do you make sense of that incoherence? It's not to throw your arms up in the air and say it's complicated. it's to do what James has suggested, to think calmly, to focus on individuals and organizations, and think individual questions along the lines of, what is this particular individual's interest? Because it may very well clash with the interests of the Russian government, even Putin himself. And as soon as you adopt that mindset, yes, it can seem like a very banal thing to say, but it's, I think, quite a simple bit of advice that isn't made enough. And as soon as you adopt that mindset, then the hope is that more useful academic debate and policymaking debate will flow from it.
I fully agree with that. More questions? This week, the Duma elections will be held in Russia, and as we know, it will be a 3-day voting. This indeed further increases room for fraud and mass falsification. It is well known that Putin's popularity has dropped in Russia by 27%. is it by 27 or to 27 or so, and the support towards the united Russia has been also declining. On the other hand, Russia's prominent opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been imprisoned. Considering all these, what are the chances, if any, for the opposition in Russia, in your opinion? So this is a two-part question. What are the chances, if any, for the opposition in Russia? And in your opinion, how will Putin attempt to increase support towards him and his regime in the future? Or shall we expect that his personal, as well as the popularity of the United Russias, will continue to decline even further? Wow, that's an interesting, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting election that we're looking at. I don't know if anyone's willing to comment on that, but it really is an interesting election that we're looking at. I was reading up on it just yesterday. I mean, the amount of political entities that they've barred from participating in the election on charges of extremism, and extremism, as people who know me know, is a word that triggers me. That's, I mean, violent extremism, terrorism, that's my domain. But yeah, it really is an interesting election that's coming up in 4 days. So would anybody care to comment on that?
Yes, I'm more than willing to talk about it, because it's another case of making clear complexity. So I think the Kremlin is nervous in a way that it hasn't been leading up to elections in past years. And that primarily is because of United Russia's approval ratings, which is, I think, where the question asker got 27% from. It's been hovering around 27, 28% now for a while. And that's difficult for the Kremlin because it means that they have to do even more than usual in order to unlevel the playing field, lock Navalny up, destroy his movement, block access to the smart voting website, offer incentives, offer these one-off pre-election payments to pensioners, members of the military, and law enforcement. So we know that these types of carrots and sticks are used before many elections, but we're seeing it in the run-up to these September elections much more so than, for example, in 2016, the last State Duma elections. The question of what's going to have to happen after the elections is fascinating. So when we talk about elections, we can often focus on these anti-democratic moves, but at the end of the day, when Russians are going to the polls, they're not thinking primarily about whether the elections are giving them an opportunity to have a meaningful say in who's selected. They know at the end of the day, United Russia is going to win, Putin is going to win. What they're thinking is, are prices rising? Am I better off than I was a year ago, 5 years ago? And the worry is that prices have been rising. The Kremlin has had to intervene, and going forward, that will be the point to focus on. If the Kremlin can make sure that people feel as though life with Putin might not be great, but if it's okay and prices don't continue to rise and their quality of life goes down, then they will be fine. But it's a real question about how long the Kremlin can stop prices from rising. Putin's approval ratings at the moment, I think, are around 60%. They've declined a bit. So maybe that 27% either relates to United Russia approval figure, or they're comparing Putin's approval, for example, just after the annexation of Crimea compared to now. Those would be roughly the same numbers. And then very quickly, I see James has raised his hand on opposition chances. I think it's highly unlikely that smart voting is going to cause a big upset. There is evidence that it can affect things, but only on the margins. And that's not to knock it. It was never really, I think, the honest belief of Team Navalny that smart voting would deprive United Russia of a constitutional majority in the State Duma. Smart voting is very much better at the regional and local level to unseat United Russia candidates. And the hope is that that will snowball, that it will convince people that, yes, elections might not give you an honest chance, that they're not democratic elections in the true sense, but you can still make a difference. So don't boycott them, take part. And then over time, slowly but surely, we can win. I think that is the hope. So opposition chances, not great in the traditional sense, but they can make a difference, I think.
Thank you, Ben. James, did you want to comment on this?
Yes, please. I think every State Duma election risks providing a reminder that the Russian Federation is not a unitary state. It is composed of very different regions facing very different problems. Why was Navalny poisoned? Understand that if you answer the question, when was he poisoned? As long as he was extremely popular in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the regime thought they could contain it. What was happening is that he was breaking out of those constraints and becoming a nationally unifying figure, and that they can't tolerate. And so they thought they got rid of him. Now they think they have another way of getting rid of him. If they should really let him out and release him, it will be their way of saying, we know our time is over. They cannot tolerate a national opposition, and they have designed all of the state organs around the necessity to prevent it very effectively, and they could probably do that. But what they cannot do, and they know they can't do it, is wipe out, another major factor in Russian life, which is bunt, which are, explosions of anger, riot, uprising, breakdown in various places. This is very, very likely. So it would be a great mistake to imagine that if the regime undermines itself or Russia destabilizes itself in some way, this paves the way for a democratic opposition to come to power. I agree with Ben. I think that that particular course is most unlikely. But we could find, Russia becoming increasingly turbulent and destabilized, not from abroad, but from inside. And so, again, this is, this story is not, the story is unfolding. It is not over. Thanks.
We have two more questions, and I know I've abused of your time enough already.
You have cut.
I'm happy
Kasia, would
to
you like to
forgo my contribution and just, we can move on with the questions.
Well, yeah, we do have just two questions left.
Right.
And one is specifically, right, okay, here's the question. Does Russia develop same narratives regarding other neighboring countries such as Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia? And if yes, at what extent does this, or to what extent does this narrative resonate with internal politics of these countries? And this is a question for James.
Could you read it rather quickly?
Sure. Sorry.
Just again, please.
Sorry. Does Russia develop same narratives? Does Russia develop similar narratives regarding other neighboring countries such as Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia? And if yes, to what extent does this narrative resonate with internal politics of this country, of these countries?
That's a great question. I think with, as with the sort of conflicts that Russia provokes and wages, I think you're looking at a common stock of the premises and ingredients, but applied very differently in different cases. Now, Russians love saying, at official level and privately, we understand that the Baltic countries are different and they're not part of our civilizational space, and what is happening in Ukraine has no relationship to you. And then you ask them, oh, you mean Narva is not part of your civilizational space? Latgala and Lithuania is not part of this. Oh no, we don't mean that. Of course, that is part of the Russian world. So, therefore, you are insisting, as you do in Ukraine, that you do have a right to defend in your terms your compatriots in our countries and to limit our sovereignty. And you have a right to talk to our state authorities, our democratically elected governments, about their internal affairs. And you have a right to assist various people in various organizations in different ways. I don't want to get into too difficult territory, but if you look at the Saglasia party in Latvia, for example, the Harmony party, not very difficult to look into the sources of this. Look into their relationship of certain people with the Russian embassy and with the Kremlin. And you start to see connections which you would expect to see if you come from Ukraine, if you come from Georgia. So the mix is all there, but the circumstances and the possibilities differ. This is where Russian pragmatism comes in to the equation. So, obviously see if my colleagues agree with me on this all. Now, I've just had one other thing, very interesting about the Russian view of Europe. As they see things, and I think this is for them the solution, they have no quarrel with what they call the historical West. By that, they mean the Holy Roman Empire and some additions to it, and basically EU and NATO as we knew them in the Cold War behind the Oder-Neisse line and all the rest. We have no quarrel with that. Fine. We're quite sincere about it. But then there is this other part of Europe, which is the Russian world, which is defined very permissively. These are all the people in all the countries that we have historically influenced, and we have a rightful, legitimate historical influence over these people now, and that has to be recognized. And this cuts across state lines. It cuts across the NATO-EU demarcation lines. We like to think, people sitting in Britain like to think, and some in Estonia like to think, oh, they respect the NATO, non-NATO demarcation line. No, they respect the correlation of forces, but they don't see that line as being legitimate because it cuts across the civilizational line. And then the Russians also think, well, between these two entities, the historical West and Ruski Mir, there needs to be a gray zone in which nothing happens, a condominium, our defense perimeter. This is their whole view of the world and of Europe. And as long as we resist it, they are going to keep pushing. It's a problem we have. I rest my case. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Ben, Katerina, would you like to comment on that, or shall we move on? All right. Well, there's one final question. Russian soft power is especially appealing, I think, in the post-Soviet states. What are the main differences between the tools, sources, and techniques that Russia is using to spread the narratives in the post-Soviet states as opposed to the way it does it in the West? Would anyone care to comment on that?
Yes, soft power. Russian understanding of soft power is not so much soft as power. So it's a range of instruments. And from that point of view, what I've been observing in various countries, including, and this is absolutely fascinating with regard to Belarus. We know where Ukraine is. One of the biggest claims of the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence was its ability to stand up to Russia. So this has become, a legitimizing, a historical claim that Russia is standing up opposing Russia. But Belarus has a very different narrative. When you talk to the Russian opposition last year, it was deliberately non-geopolitical. Russia was cut out of discussion. This is not about Russia. And yet, within a year, we have almost what I would call radicalization of the Belarusian opposition, and talking about Russia, talking about elections, talking about Putin is part of discussion what's going to happen in Belarus. So from that point of view, the soft power and access to the media and having Russian sort of media being listened to in Ukraine and Belarus is a double-edged sword. In terms of actually this diminutive sort of this narrative full of historical disdain works in Russia, doesn't work in Belarus or in Ukraine. or total, misinterpretation of, for the survival reasons of the Russian political regime, they present something which is happening in Ukraine, Georgia, and Belarus in a particular light. It's a function of domestic developments in Russia, how those countries are basically depicted in the media. And yet, because of the Russian language media, those narratives are listened to and actually have an opposite effect inside those countries, including this sort of radical change in the way that Russian opposition thinks about Russia and Putin in particular. So soft power, having this enormous soft power, historical unity, religion, language, and even citizenship is a double-edged sword. And my feeling is that the more regime in Russia becomes entrenched and fights for survival, the more it uses the basically post-Soviet space as a ground to basically use it for domestic purposes, but it's actually counterproductive. But in the West, it is used very differently. And we have to now, for example, observe a much smarter use of soft power. It's not only sponsoring individuals and various think tanks and political parties, but also, for example, an increased effort initiatives to invite young German and French leaders, for example, youth leaders, to Russia, to learn about the Russian world of the post-Soviet space. So basically creating sort of a bubble in which those people strategically selected actually tend to embrace and sympathize with the Russian perspective. So it is a very complex and ongoing project, but Russia has been becoming, on the one hand, certain things like the Skripal affair has been really so toxic in Britain. On the other hand, there are more, there's now more effort made to make sure that Russia can exert soft power and develop sort of allies and sympathizers in the West.
Thank you for that. James, Ben, would you like to comment on that?
I, as some of you know, wrote a book on this subject for Chatham House about 8 years ago. I don't want to repeat what's in it, but there's a paradox here. And I think what Katya said is more or less consistent with what I'm about to say, that very often I think what Russians call soft power is handicapped in its former imperial domains because they assume we know these people, we have nothing new to learn. And they can therefore make some egregious blunders. But the approach is very templated and there's very little variation. The Western view of soft power is to basically get others to want the things you want. The Russian approach here has always been to identify those people who already want it, or who they think already want it, like, beginning with compatriots, but, others, and mobilize them, make them more powerful, give them moral, political, and of course, financial support. And that's pretty much, and propaganda support, and that's pretty much what they do. And sometimes it's very effective and sometimes not, but there are no surprises. I agree with Katya, and what I find striking is the extent to which, because they know they don't know the West, it's not as they say it, see it, their civilization. They spend a lot of time studying us, and they're very interested in the kinds of words and themes that have resonances here that they can adapt and adopt and adapt to their own discourse, and sometimes very effectively. That is one reason why they have quite successfully bonded with so many far left and far right movements in Europe, because they understand the grievances that many constituencies have with the ideology, if I can use that word, of European integration as it is now developed. And they focus on something which is not technical, it's not abstract, it's not values related, It's about identity. It's about culture. It's about who we are and who we are not. It's always very impressive to me that one country, that this is spectacularly unsuccessful and always will be unsuccessful in my view, in one country that has become in many ways deeply opposed to the way the EU now defines itself, and that is Poland. Because the Polish understanding of national history, of who they are, and where Russia fits in, is so strong that no grievances they feel towards Brussels are going to make for a warmer, softer approach towards Moscow. But you can't say that about everybody else, unfortunately. Certainly the further left you go, you talk about Marine Le Pen's supporters, the supporters of the right, and it's not just the far right, it's much of the established right in Italy, in Hungary, a number of other countries one can think of. Sorry, talking too much.
Now that I've successfully abused of everyone's time, I just have one very quick request, because we have been talking about the internal politics of Russia in terms of governances and everything. And the 16th myth here really is about, it's really all about Putin, and what comes after Putin might be better. Well, one thing that may have come after Putin, had it not been for, again, how Russia is run today, may have been Alexei Navalny, but he is now in prison. But Ben Noble here has a very, very interesting book out on the subject. And I was wondering if I could just abuse of another couple of minutes of your time for you to just tell us about the book. And can you also tell me when it will be available for Kindle? That's in addition to the hard copy that I've already ordered.
Brilliant. I can't answer the question about the ebook version, but a very quick summary of the book. It's called Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future, ? And the question mark is absolutely crucial, because the book is an attempt to explain to really a Western audience, or I should say an audience that doesn't follow Russian politics closely, who had questions when Navalny was poisoned in August 2020, who had questions when he returned to Russia in January of this year, of who he was, especially when they came up against the media narrative, which was very black and white, that said Navalny was this unblemished hero returning to confront the evil Putin. But then people were scratching their heads when Amnesty International gave him the label of being a prisoner of conscience, but then withdrew it because of past statements that he made. So I was approached by people who were confused, and they wanted a book on Navalny that would hopefully make sense of his complexities. I looked around, there wasn't an English language book about him. And so I decided to write a book with my co-authors, Jan-Matti Dolbaum of the University of Bremen and Morvan Lalouette, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Kent. And what we do is we look at Navalny over the last 20 years, really, and focus on his anti-corruption activism, his role as a politician, including running in the mayoral election in Moscow in 2013 and his attempt to run in the 2018 presidential election, and his role as an organizer of protests and leader of protests across the country. But we also look at how Navalny has adapted with the Kremlin, how it's not just Navalny challenging a static Kremlin who hasn't been able to adapt. Really, the book makes clear how the two have adapted with each other. But also, it's not a traditional biography. Navalny is still alive, he's only 45. What it is an attempt to make sense of Navalny the man, but also Navalny in the context of his movement. And we finished writing it when it became clear the lengths the Kremlin was willing to go in order to destroy the man and the movement. So we finished writing the book when his organizations were labeled extremist. And so now the book provides a catalogue of the creation of an organization that then was dismantled before our very eyes. So hopefully the book makes sense, as I say, of Navalny the man and the movement. And James said before, the story is not complete, granted for a different subject matter, But the book also talks about a subject matter that isn't complete. And so it'll be interesting going forward, seeing what happens with the people who previously supported him, who are activists. Looking at the Levada polling data, Navalny's approval ratings, if we're talking about approval ratings for Putin and for United Russia, for Navalny, they have sunk this year. And the question is, why is that the case? Is it because people have lost hope in Navalny, that now he's behind bars, they think, well, no, it may be that I'm not going to support him, that he isn't a possible future of Russia? Or is it because people are frightened of even responding to a Levada poll saying that I support Navalny because of the legislation changes that mean if you're associated with an extremist organization, there will be severe repercussions. But also we have to remember that the policy positions that Navalny has backed, just looking at it purely objectively at the moment, are not the types of policy positions that would mean that he would win an election against Putin if presidential elections take place on Sunday. So we have to make sense of Navalny, and that's what we try and do in the book. Treat it as objectively as people who aren't in Russia, who are involved in these political battles, who maybe the questions about Navalny's more difficult pages at the moment aren't the priority. We indulge ourselves saying, we're outside of Russia, we're going to try and make sense of this figure, and hopefully the book does that. So thank you very much, Mariam, for giving me the opportunity to give the plug for the book. And I'm sure we can put up a URL for the book itself. It's published by Hearst. It was published in the UK on the 19th of August. It's released in the US by Oxford University Press. It was supposed to come out on the 1st of September, but the books are apparently stuck on a boat outside of a port, but we've been told that it should be released this week. And the ebook is being produced, but I don't know a date as to when it will be available, unfortunately. But thanks, Mariam.
Can everyone hear me? Oh, good. All right. All right. Well, I mean, this has been an honor of a lifetime to be in this conversation with you. It really has. Just as a parting thought to everyone still watching us, I want to make it very clear that my goal with translating this publication into Georgian and publishing it and then engaging in these conversations is not superficial, blind Russia bashing. What I'm calling for, what I'm advocating for, is a more in-depth look at what Russia is, how it's run, how it conducts its foreign policy. Because given the reality that Georgia exists in, given the threats that it faces, we need more in-depth discussions and conversations about Russia. So I hope that everyone does indeed read the report that has now been translated into Georgian, because everyone at GCSD believes that not having sort of the best command of English language should be a limitation for someone to have access to good quality intellectual material such as this particular report. And in addition to me sort of wanting, for us to talk about Ben's book, the second reason I asked Ben to talk about his book is Navalny is another figure in Russian politics that we as Georgians have to have a better understanding of, because there is this sort of there are some mixed feelings about him in Georgia, understandably so. So, in conclusion, I would like to thank our speakers for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I think it's been educational, insightful. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, to listen to you. The other day, I have to admit that I had the distinct honor of getting a little bit of a chance to sit in the conversation between Katerina and James once Ben left us in preparation for this talk. It was a pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, all three of you. This has been outstanding, amazing. And before I let everyone go, I just have to say this. My most sincere gratitude goes out to Benjamin Wakefield, Lubica Polakova, James Nixie, and Adam Kowalski. These are all the representatives of Chatham House. They're most amazing people. They have all helped me put this all together. First of all, they allowed me to translate this report into Georgian. So they have all been instrumental in helping me make this happen, bring this to life. Thank you to my team at GCSD. Thank you, Nico, for helping us out, technically. And then last but never ever the least is the audience. Thank you so much for being so active, for sending in the questions. I think this has been useful and interesting to everyone. And we're very lucky. I'm very lucky to be able to say that we still have one more of these talks left. And I can promise that that one will also be just as interesting as this one. That one is scheduled for the 23rd of September. Thank you all very, very much. And regardless of where you are, have a lovely, lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.